Hi everybody, my name is Brady and I'm a 19th century American historian and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be finishing the Hitler videos from OverSimplified. Today we're going to be doing part 2. I really enjoyed part 1, more than I expected to. I guess I like the process of learning how Hitler became radicalized. There's so many factors that go into creating a Hitler. I mean, we've only ever had one Hitler, but we've had so many brutal dictators, and it's fun to learn how they got where they are, because they weren't born that way, and that's something that I guess I liked emphasizing in the first one. Hitler didn't have to be Hitler. He could have just been Hitler. And the toothbrush mustache didn't have to be a symbol of evil. It could have just been something really awkward and of its time. I don't know, but I'm excited for this one. While I'm not a 20th century person or even much of a war person, I don't even know if this is going to get into the war or if this is just going to go right up until the war and then he wants me to watch his World War II one. I'd assume it's probably that, but I'm not sure. I'm excited for this, though. This should be really cool. Let's get it started.
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war, but he kept working for the army as an informant. After the war, communists in Germany had attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about communism in general. So Hitler was tasked with infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat.
The communist thing is very fun to learn about here. Right now I'm learning a lot about Russian history, because I'm taking a class on it, although I'm not very good at it. But during this period, communism is frowned upon in a lot of places, but it's not completely like thrown out in Western countries. It still has some potential to grow into something a little bigger and maybe take a significant amount of influence within a country. It doesn't work out for the most part, but it's not over at this point, and I guess he's trying to snuff that out before it goes too far.
A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole bunch of red flags, so Hitler went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs, so he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking abilities impressed the party's leadership and supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top. He decided the party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme. The Nazis weren't very specific on policy.
As far as, and
he gave it a new color scheme.
As far as designs go, the Nazi flag, and I was never gonna do a Nazi flag part on flag review, but I guess I can talk about this here. The branding isn't awful. Like it's good color choices. The swastika is not before the Nazis were the thing that you thought about. The swastika was not really that intimidating of a symbol. It was heavily featured in Buddhism and stuff like that. So honestly, it's not even a bad choice. I guess in the grand scheme of things, the rebranding kind of worked, seemingly.
The Nazis weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens, and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics, but what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right. Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive whole Protection Detachment, later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment, or SA for short. Their job was to defend Nazi party meetings and intimidate political opponents, and they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which...
That's something definitely I'm sure worth reading about. Like, what happened to the soldiers who ended up getting thrown out of the army? A lot of people, even today, I look at people who have to leave the military before they're ready to, and they leave feeling a little bit unfulfilled. Of course, this is kind of anecdotal stuff that I've just kind of seen. I don't really have data on that, so I can't speak to it. But it seems like a lot of people who, when they do leave that life, it gives that life gave them a sense of purpose, identity. There's so much that goes into living a military life that if you leave before you're ready, I'd imagine you are more susceptible to join groups like this that give you kind of a new purpose, a new identity. So I find that very fun to learn about, I guess.
Grew larger and larger over time. The new democratic government that formed after World War I was pretty weak and ineffective. In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919, one US dollar was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, one US dollar was equal to 4.2 trillion marks. The price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany struggled to pay the Allies. The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treat.
Oh, that's gonna piss people off. The money thing is something that, while I haven't studied this period, I can kind of relate to with some of the stuff that I have studied. My home state of Rhode Island, in the early American days, like at the beginning, we had a money printing issue. We had a party here that was very down with printing money, and the problem is if you're trying to create like a union with all these other states, and then you try to make them accept your useless money, it just doesn't go very well. Of course, there are regulations that are eventually put in place. The states can't really be in charge of that like they used to be.
Treated the German civilians badly, and in total, approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation. Germans were furious, and Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November 1923, inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters, he marched on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not.
Oh.
Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. And when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book.
Making impassioned speeches during a trial. I know there are some people I'm thinking of the American legal system. They don't give you a lot of room to make impassioned speeches on the stand. You don't really get a lot. I mean, maybe some people get away with it, but typically it's very well controlled. It makes me wonder what it's like in the German legal system. I'd imagine it must be a little bit more lenient.
The whole affair was covered by the media nationwide, and it made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany, but the everyday Germans still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence and the shouting and how unpolitician-like he was, but a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that
I knew that the presence of communists was at least somewhat significant in Nazi Germany, or what would become Nazi Germany, I guess. But I didn't know it was going to be like one of the main parties, even at this point where everybody would be more inclined to be extreme. I always thought they would be a little bit still more on the fringe, even when people are driven to extremes. But okay, there we go. That's interesting.
He was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype. Election after election, the Nazis became more and more popular, until in 1932, they became the biggest party in the German parliament. Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president, and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general, Paul von Hindenburg.
So, military figures, I guess in a sense they're both military figures, but this guy's a general, so I guess generals do well in presidential elections over there as well, because historically they've done pretty well in American presidential elections, so that's kind of cool to know. Sick mustache, dude. He beats him in the mustache department. You gotta have the curls, man. That is power right there. Let me just go back just a sec. Oh, Hitler's like ideology early on. I have a lot of trouble grasping it, because there was a book that I remember being pretty good. It was so good that I hardly remember anything about it. It's called Black Earth. But I remember reading that for a class a couple years ago, and it had a lot on Hitler's ideology, and I had a little bit of trouble understanding exactly what he was all for. I couldn't tell how religious he was and what kind of interpretation of religion it was. It clearly didn't seem very conventional. He had a very, it seemed very state-centric way. It's like he used religion in a way that, like, to validate the state, and that if that is the end to it. But I don't know if that's necessarily the correct interpretation, because I struggled so much with it. All right, I'll see you later. When you are learning about like a new place, and as somebody who just doesn't really touch on German history, I don't know what flies over there. I found the same problem while trying to learn Russian history. Often I have to unlearn my assumptions that come from studying American history.
Of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president, and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general, Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the leader of the biggest party, though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism, and leader of the Center Party von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor, and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power. I mean, we'll get to keep our power, and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet."
Oh, this is ominous here. And when you throw it, it's weird, because you're probably walking into this like, oh, I know what's going to happen. But a lot of the minor, I don't even want to call them minor figures, all the sub-Hitler figures in this period, I wouldn't know much about. So I don't know what the significance of this is going to be. Clearly, they want to channel the excitement behind Hitler towards what they want to accomplish, but clearly this dude on the left has something a little bit more ominous in mind. Perhaps he's a little more in line with Hitler than he's letting on.
What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire.
Oh.
Historians still aren't sure who did it, and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents. Communists and others were sent off to...
It's a false flag operation, which I hate saying because it makes you sound like a crazy person. But yeah, that's a very normal thing. That's what I always go back to the theories about George W. Bush when everybody was like, Bush did 9/11, but there is something there where, like, they just genuinely thought Bush wanted to go to war at all costs, and that was the way to do it. It didn't seem like it added up, but there's a certain level of distrust of the government that I can almost respect. But sometimes it goes a little far. But that sounds... I mean, the framing is obviously against Hitler here, so I would assume... I don't know, man. I assume he did it, but I don't have anything to base it on. I just have this.
First concentration camp in Dachau. At this time, the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect opportunity. No. He introduced a law to Parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions entirely on his own. With his political opponents imprisoned and the SA intimidating others, Hitler's law passed. Just 2 months after becoming Chancellor, Hitler was now a dictator. He still had one problem. The leader of the SA wanted the SA to take over the job of the regular German army, and the German army didn't like that idea. Hitler needed to maintain the support of his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA. So one night in June 1934, he had Röhm and many other of his own SA officers rounded up and murdered. While he was at it, he took the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well.
What? What do you want? Do you want something? I'm trying to learn about Hitler here. He's actually nodding his head when I say that. What do you want? What do you need? Use your words. You want food? You want num-nums? I already gave you snacks. Do you need more snacks? I can give you more snacks if you want, but... Oh, yes? Yes? Gotcha. He wants more snacks. Ah! I just kicked my computer. He's a good boy, I promise. I'm going to go back for a minute while he enjoys his snack. Because I did not catch that. I was a little distracted.
And the German army didn't like that idea. Hitler needed to maintain the support of his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA. So one night in June 1934, he had Röhm and many other of his own SA officers rounded up and murdered. While he was at it, he took the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well. Politicians who had disagreed with him in the past, reporters who had printed negative articles about him, one guy who did absolutely nothing, but they thought he was someone else. In some cases, even their families were murdered.
That's very interesting. I'm thinking of this because the SA, it comes out of the military, but now to maintain loyalty from the military, he has to get rid of the SA. Which makes me wonder what the challenges were for perhaps filtering members of the SA back into the military. I'd assume he's not going to just do a decree like, yep, you guys are going back into the military now. We're disbanding this. I assume he doesn't really want to go about doing something like that. So I don't... Some time has passed. I don't know what the... This is... I guess it is oversimplified, and I can't expect to understand it all from this right here. But it's got me wondering. It's got me wanting to know more. So I got that going for me, I guess.
Total, up to 200 people were killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives.
I think I've heard of that.
Satisfied that they
I think I've heard that name,
pledged total allegiance to their new Führer, and Hitler's control was now absolute. Life in Germany changed violently. Freedom of the press, expression, and public assembly were suspended. Jews were initially branded and their businesses boycotted. And eventually, Hitler would go on to have 6 million Jewish men, women, and children killed in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into sterilization for physical and mental imperfections. The Hitler Youth became a way to brainwash the young. Boys were trained to fight and returned home from camp violent. Girls were told their purpose was to have many pure Aryan children, and they would sometimes return from camp pregnant. When their parents were understandably horrified, their children would threaten to turn them over to the Gestapo for standing in the way of Germany's greatness. The standard greeting changed, and you could be sent to a concentration camp for not using it.
People wanting to turn their parents over to the Gestapo. That's something that I've seen in Russian history as well, from what I've been learning lately. So this is not at all surprising, especially when you try to implement a culture from above. That is one of the. It seems to be what they're trying to do. Uh, it's going to be easier to get the younger generation than the older generation. So, yeah, that seems to make sense. He in Russia during the early Soviet Union, there's a lot of the older generation that still remembers serfdom and stuff, and they're very skeptical. But then the younger generation, it's going to be a little bit easier to get them to buy into your ideology. So this is not at all surprising, though a little bit different. There are some themes there.
This way, it seemed like everyone was a Nazi supporter. If you dared oppose Hitler or speak out against him in any way, you also would be sent to a concentration camp. German nationalism captivated the young Adolf. Extreme ideology and anti-Semitism festered in him as a young man living a hard life on the streets. Germany's defeat in the First World War filled him with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. A political movement that treated him like a god, and hundreds of thousands looking up to him as their savior, made him a megalomaniac. And soon, his aggressive foreign policies would drag the world into a second tragic global conflict, otherwise known as...
Yeah. That seems like it's going to be a lot more fun now that I've gone through the Hitler stuff, because he is obviously so essential to telling that story. I am actually a little bit more curious about that. You can tell this story in an oversimplified fashion, and I can kind of get it, but it has me asking questions about broader German culture at the time. I think the first part did a great job at describing kind of like a simple version of the broader German culture, but I feel like this part needed to be like 3 times as long for me to be satisfied with it. It's just so, and his videos are so much longer now, seemingly, than they used to be. It's almost like they're not even, they don't even really deserve the title Oversimplified anymore. Sometimes they seem to go into so much for a YouTube video. I really did like this one, though. It has me asking more questions than I did in the first one. The first one gave me some much needed context, though. I guess going into his early life, there's only so much on his early life, but when you get into this, he's starting to get entangled in broader political movements, so there's probably so much more to go into, and if he wants to get into like the minutia of it, we probably get really bogged down in the details, and it wouldn't be oversimplified anymore. So, yeah. I liked this video. It was fun, and I'm looking forward to checking out more of his stuff at some point down the line. There's usually a decent break between my oversimplified reactions, but eventually I'll do another one, and World War II is probably going to be one of the next ones. Maybe. We'll see. I don't know. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next. Oh, yeah. If there's any good videos on this period that you want me to check out, put them in the comment section below. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, who knows. And I will see you guys next time.